Swastola Sura. I am Seraphis, the procrastinating space pirate, and I apologize as to the lateness of the last video, but there was a lot of detail, and between recording, organizing, family, and holiday long weekend for Chocolate Egg Day, it was all kinds of complicated. Anywho, today I bring you something a little special, for you see, we're all mad here. Oh, you can't help that. We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad. We are all mad here opens up. Well, let's talk about this cover. It's not my favorite, that's the Stars of Fire's cover. But this one is an easy second. I love the imagery here, the silhouette of the evil queen, witch, whatever, and within the silhouette, the hero on horseback riding through the deep, dark forest. It's so provocative of the genre. Is it Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Alice in Wonderland? It could be any of those, or countless others. It could even be the tale of Tam Lin from Scotland. But whatever it is, it's so provoking of the idea of fairy tales. Anyway, let's dive in. Part 1, Once Upon a Time. Now, just quickly, I want to bring up the foreword's title. The woods are real and dark and full of wolves. It's just eye-catching and sets the tone of the book just as well as the cover art. Anyway, Chapter 1, Upon Fairytales, is pretty much a TLDR of the book's concepts and ideas, summarized into a couple of pages. Now, again, since that's what this review is, we'll skip this over. Chapter 2, Building Fairytale Settings, is the meat and potatoes of the Whitebook, I'd say. It discusses literally every aspect of building your fairytale setting. Using an existing setting covers the subheadings of how familiar are you and your players with the setting? How will you manage expectations? Do you tell the setting's original story? And bring out the tropes. There's a brief side note here on page 15 about public domain and copyright, and explains that even though that frozen fairytale game idea seems cool, streaming or releasing character sheets might be, in a legal sense, best not done. Creating an original setting then brings up how to create an original setting, while being inspired by a list of fairy tales, myths, folklore, and more, with subheadings of what is the genre, what are the cliches, themes, and motifs, what is the magic, what's rare, what's valued, how do people get around, and what is death. Especially that last one gave me mad Discworld vibes, and death with a capital D who talks in Christopher Lee's legendary voice. Mixing genres is our next lot of subheadings, with understanding the listings, which gives a list of mixed fairytale genre examples with overviews, elements and motifs, risks, magic and wonder, and inspiration. The lists include traditional, modern, dark, horror, romance, science fiction, comedy, whimsy, and urban legend, all pretty self-explanatory. Fairytale cliches, themes, and motifs is our next subheading, and gives us great big lists of suggestions, ideas, creatures, and more, with common tropes, individual story touchstones, and lots of tables, haha. On fairytale magic is our last subheading here, and talks about the use of magic commonly in fairy tales, from the commonplace to the few to the exception. Its headings include magic just is, magic obeys no rules, magic isn't singular, magic is common and the common is magic, common doesn't mean boring, fairytale magic is not fantasy magic, and magic means whimsy. I feel like this last subheading, especially, should probably get a discussion video all of itself, as magic in fairy tales is often so much more than magic in other fantasy. Something I'll say here is that many of these fairy tale early chapters have quotes from great fantasy authors on their perspectives of fairy tales, and it is insightful to read. Chapter 3, Building Fairytale Campaigns, takes us into the ins and outs of building a fairytale campaign, from scratch, including design adventures and the types of adventures to think about when making fairytale campaigns, story seeds to get players hooked into the adventure, problematic elements. I have personal thoughts on this. Look, I get the care Americans like to project, but culturally, I don't care about the views and opinions, any more than I imagine someone from the Netherlands cares about an Aussie critiquing their cultural eccentricities. Fairy tales worth retelling come from a different time, and you need to remember that. But despite the gender roles and other aspects commonly seen in Western folklore and fairy tales, it honestly doesn't matter. One of my favourite fairy tales is an Egyptian tale called The Doomed Prince, which sees this prince as the focus of the tale. The entire story is actually lost, but part of it that survives is that after meeting and marrying his wife, the prince is about to meet one of his dooms in the form of a snake. But his wife awakens, sees the snake, grabs the sword, and kills it. Typical gender roles, my ass. Point is, if you find Western fairy tales problematic, look elsewhere. Other cultures have some great ones that don't bring up problematic elements. And yes, I'm aware this section also goes into child abuse, sexual abuse, generally abuse in general, but maybe stop focusing on just Western folklore. Chapter 4, Running Fairy Tale Games, starts off with telling the GM that they should say yes and to the players, pretty much about everything. Personally, I think that's dangerous advice to a GM who doesn't have experience, or at least wisdom, to know how to handle that properly. It gives examples on how to, but I still find it irresponsible advice. Other subheadings include describe, don't define, overcome magic fatigue, tumble down the rabbit hole, ground the players, use props, and make bad guys bad. All pretty straightforward. The last section is on special rules, and the first one is death. I'm going to be honest, advice on death? Terry Pratchett, Discworld, Christopher Lee's voice. Make sure to have death make a comment about being rinse-winded again. Hilarious! We also have curses and curse intrusions, and types of curses, and a curse table. Who the fuck needs that? Because of course there is. And also blessings, with the same blessing intrusions and blessing table and such. Finally, we have GM intrusions, suggestions for the genre. Honestly, they're pretty obvious stuff at this point. Think of the Wizard of Oz, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Red Riding Hood, etc. Lastly, consent and boundaries. As always, know your players, and just be a fucking human being. If someone at your table lost a baby, don't put a dead baby in the game. If someone at the table got hard, don't put sexual abuse in your game. Chapter 5, Playing in Fairy Tale Games, is the start of the players section of the book, with this chapter providing advice on getting into the train of thought or headspace of a character in a fairy tale world. It talks about expectations, not being nitpicky about setting, especially if it's a pre-existing one, and pushing the creativity boundary with possibilities, magic, and intrusions. It also provides an example of minor and major special effect options for rolls on 19 and 20. Chapter 6, Creating Your Character, assists players in creating their characters, and provides examples of protagonists and antagonists from fairy tales. How they would be sentenced for a Cypher character, and provides type name alternatives for a fairy tale game. Again, my problem here is that I don't feel like it has much diversity beyond an American perspective, and nothing from non-European folklore outside of Sinbad, but no Aladdin. Speaking of the genie of the lamp, did you know there are two jinn in that story? The sorcerer gives Aladdin a ring to go on the quest, and it contains a lesser jinn in it, while the lamp contains a more powerful major jinn. I'm sure I remember reading at some point that the ring jinn was a Mafrit or something like that, while the lamp jinn was a Marid. Anyway, tidbits. Chapter 7, Equipment, introduces a range of interesting new items to Cypher, as well as suggestions for things like currency in a fairy tale setting. Pretty straightforward. Chapter 8, Ciphers and Artifacts, is another pretty straightforward section. It's new ciphers and artifacts for fairy tale games. A cool addition before the list, though, is that they point out that in a fairy tale setting, instead of damage or such for carrying too many ciphers, it instead attracts fey beings that cause mischief on the characters. I gotta say, this idea, I actually like it a lot. I will point out, typically American, a genie's lamp is in here, but it's a single wish and it doesn't really play into the lore, and no genie's ring exists among the artifacts. If I was being picky, I would point out not much is tailored to Sinbad either, but whatever. Chapter 9, Beasts and Beings, brings us to the bestiary of creatures for fairy tales, or at least what they're willing to provide. As a person of Irish heritage, I like all the fae, but as someone equally of Egyptian descent, I dislike the lack of creature diversity in a published book. And as an Aussie raised very multiculturally from the 80s, I might add, I can tell you there's some real bangers that were missed. Egyptian, Asian, Arabian, African. Oh my god, African, seriously. Talk about a missed fairy tale. Anansi, the spider. Quickest way to learn something, everyone go watch the Anansi video from Overly Sarcastic Productions. Now. I'll wait. Part 2, Adventures 3, contains fairy tale stories designed for use as adventures. The first 2 being shorts, the third being full adventure. Chapter 10, adventure short The Apple Pip Witch, is designed to see the players as siblings who are off to rescue their father from a witch. Chapter 11, Cypher short I'll Gnaw Your Bones, is set up as the players being animals who must escape trolls who want to eat them. Chapter 12, Full Adventure Between Worlds, sees the characters being indebted to the Queen of the Sele Fae. Each summer they go to her realm and do tasks for 3 months until they pay off their 7-year debt to her. When the players head there this time, they find the realm is in disarray and are tasked with restoring the realm and healing the Fae Queen. Overall, Part 2 isn't bad. Part 3, Lost in the Heartwood, begins with a quote from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, with Alice's conversation with the Cheshire Cat. We're all mad here. From what I've gleaned of the setting, the conversation between Alice and the Cheshire Cat appears to have been a heavy influence on Shana making the Heartwood setting. At least, that's been my take. Chapter 13, Welcome to the Heartwood, introduces the setting to GMs and players alike. Chapter 14, Mental Health in Games, addresses points about fairy tales that deal with mental health and how to incorporate those elements in a non-intrusive way. More on this later. Chapter 15, Running Games in the Heartwood, is pretty much a section for GMs to get to know tidbits and GMing notes about the setting. Chapter 16, Creating Heartwood Characters, is a really big section though for players, as it gives new descriptors and foci. These are both racial and general descriptors, as well as new foci built from ability tables from the CSR, with maybe a few new abilities added. Mostly, changes are flavorful. Befriends the Black Dog is an example of this that uses a lot of the abilities from Dances with Dark Matter, but flavors them in a way that's more fantasy or fairy tale like. If for no other reason, this should really be a factor in buying this book. Although I suppose you could just check out old Gus's Cypher system resource document and find the same info. No money drop required. Chapter 17, Heartwood Atlas, does what it says on the box and provides an overview of the Heartwood world, heavy quotations there, and its notable locations. This also exemplifies the art style of the world too, with this almost old school Disney-esque design to it. There's a lot in here, and if you get the book, I recommend checking it out, especially if you have trouble with Feywild concepts. Chapter 18, What the Moon Dreamt. Okay, I've only given this one a skim through, but this one, to me, comes off very Kingdom Heartsy. Sorry, did I say this was the first Heartwood adventure? Yeah, this is the first Heartwood adventure. And it's very Kingdom Heartsy in its vibe. If you know, you know. And that's all I'll say about that. Chapter 19, The Prince Who Would Seek Death, is the second Heartwood adventure and deals with the player characters being summoned by the titular prince to retrieve his death, with a capital D, so that his life may come to an end. An interesting glimpse, but this takes me back to something I wanted to do earlier. Actually, dropping the barrier here because shit is about to get deep and personal, so be prepared, motherfuckers. Within the Whitebook, there has been frequent references to mental health issues and mental health support, and while I personally think that more people should be aware and the stigma of mental health really needs to fuck right off, I can't help but feel irritated by North Americans telling me this. A notoriously anti-mental health supporting culture who, let's not forget, would rather blame mental health for an epidemic of gun violence and do nothing about it than make it harder for people to get guns in the first place. Our conservative government was the one who instituted our gun laws back in the late 90s after the Port Arthur massacre, so stop saying it can't be done. You're just fucked and irresponsible. But more importantly, I want to address a continual theme of mental health in this Whitebook: anxiety, depression, and suicide. Oh yeah, it's about to be a fun conversation. Guess what? All three apply to me. In fact, the year I took up GMing, 2015, 2016, I actually came after I tried to commit suicide. And my GP, family, and friends all told me to find something to focus on a brighter time. Now, this was obviously a short term solution for my GP while he set me up seeing a psychologist, which, while things have been busy and it's been a year since I've seen my psychologist, yeah, she has worked with me for the last 8 years to get me through the worst of my disability, anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, and being a dad. I cannot imagine what things would be like if I didn't have that support. Although, according to Grim School, I've been slipping into a grumpy arsehole for a while. So, that's what a year without my psychologist has done to me. But I want to say this: stigma over mental health is unwarranted and is like making fun of someone who can't walk. You're the asshole, not the person with mental health issues. Which, by the way, I mentioned my own disability before. I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome back in 2001 at the age of 16, which fucked up my life and prospects, and has been the source of my slow degrade of mental health. Couple that with 2 years later, my single parent mum dying, a string of other bad luck and deaths over the next few years, and yeah, it sucks to lose someone, you're only someone, and that loss can be hard to deal with. I knew my mum for 18 years. Well, I don't remember her for the first 3 years old, so more like 15. I had my faithful companion, my coolie dog Kai, for 20 years, and my mum's sister, my godmother, for 34 years. Again, minus 3 years because I have no memories before I was 3. They've all died, and it's hard. I was too young to know my mum as a grown adult, and have to kind of get that now from my mum's sisters in laws, aka my aunts. Anyway, this has been getting darker, so fuck it. My point is, considering how I frequently see North Americans talk about mental health, violence, and other aspects as almost carefree and unfazed by the morality, I've just had a bit of a gripe with this book telling me about mental health, especially because of how North American media demonizes mental health support. It would be nice to see some changes and improvements, but thoughts and prayers. Alright, okay. Side tangent over. Back matters. Happily ever after, starting from page 217 onwards, the book goes into its inspirations and resources, index, and the fairy tale game consent checklist. Fuck. Which nicely rounds out the book. Is We Are All Mad Here worth it? Well, once again, I find myself in the position of every other book. Does any of the factors brought up here in this review apply to your game? Is your game fantasy or, as the Japanese would say, isekai, transported to another world? If so, then yeah, this book has an amazing array of bits and bobs that could be useful for the GM and players alike. If not, then you probably wouldn't get much out of it. Personally, I can find some use in it, but that's just me. I am glad this book spent so much time of its sidebars talking about mental health. I feel like, especially in our communities, it doesn't get talked about enough, and it doesn't get talked about in the right way. Anywho, thanks for listening to this little review. Assuming everything goes smoothly, this should be out on time-ish. Yeah, so thanks everyone, and next time, well, Godforsaken. Ancestral Spirit Nexus. Cease divination.